everyone, and welcome to another deep dive with us. Today, we're tackling a thinker who's known for being a bit of a mindbender.
Yeah.
Slavoj Žižek.
That's right.
Now, he's a Slovenian philosopher, but he draws heavily on Lacanian psychoanalysis to analyze, everything you can think of, from pop culture and movies to politics.
Yeah.
We're working with an academic interview with him today where he really gets into some fascinating ideas, like the decline of traditional authority.
Right.
And the search for new ways of understanding how our minds work, how societies function.
Yeah.
And really what it means to be a subject in the world today. So buckle up because we're going to be challenging some assumptions today.
I think one of the most interesting things about this interview right off the bat is that Žižek himself acknowledges that he might be presenting a limited view of Lacan.
Oh, interesting.
Even he is saying, hey, maybe I'm not getting the full picture here. But he also points out that that's kind of what makes studying Lacan so fascinating.
Okay.
Is that Lacan himself was always evolving and changing and refining his ideas.
So it's not like we're reading a textbook where everything is set in stone.
Right.
It's more like we're having a conversation with someone who's actively wrestling with these big questions.
Yeah, and always pushing the boundaries, not afraid to kind of shift his position if that's where his thinking led him.
I mean, that takes a certain amount of intellectual humility, I guess.
Absolutely.
To be able to say, okay, what I thought before, maybe that wasn't quite right.
Yeah, let me rethink this.
Let me reapproach it.
Exactly. And Žižek brings up some great examples of this.
Okay, let's hear it.
So, for example, Lacan's view of the Cartesian cogito.
Oh, okay, so that whole, I think, therefore I am?
Exactly, yeah.
How does that fit in with Lacan's evolving thought?
Well, early on, he was kind of playing with Heidegger's critique of subjectivity.
Okay.
But then later, he actually fully embraces the Cartesian cogito.
So a full 180.
Yeah, pretty much.
Wow, so that really shows you how dynamic Lacan's thinking was. And it wasn't just about, being right or wrong.
No.
It was about this constant process of exploration and challenging your own assumption.
Yeah, absolutely. And this connects to Heidegger's ideas on language in a really interesting way.
Okay. How so?
So Heidegger saw language as the house of being, right?
Okay.
This space where we find meaning and connection and belonging.
Okay, so language is a comforting thing.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not home.
But Lacan had a totally different take.
Oh, really?
He saw language as a torture house.
Oh, wow. Okay, so the opposite end of the spectrum.
Yeah, a much darker view for sure.
So what did he mean by that, language as a torture house?
Well, think about it. How often do you struggle to find the right words to say what you really mean?
All the time.
Right, or how often do misunderstandings happen just because of the, slipperiness of language?
Yeah, you think you're saying one thing and someone else hears it totally differently.
Exactly, and for Lacan, that's that torture house at work.
Okay.
We're constantly wrestling with these gaps and distortions in meaning.
So it's not just about language being imperfect.
Right.
It's that imperfection actually shapes who we are and how we interact with the world.
Precisely. And this idea is echoed in the work of some really interesting writers like Frieda Jelinek from Austria.
Okay.
Her writing is she's almost torturing language.
Okay.
Pushing it to its limits to expose the power dynamics and even the violence that are embedded in language.
So it's almost we're constantly at war with language in a way, trying to make it say what we mean, but also being shaped by its limitations.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
And this idea of language as a torture house that really makes you think about what it means to be a subject, to have an identity in a world where language itself is so slippery.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm starting to see how these ideas connect to these big questions about self and identity. But how does this torture house of language play out in the real world?
That's where Žižek's analysis of the Joseph Fritzl case gets really fascinating.
Okay. You're going to have to remind me who that is.
Yeah, so Joseph Fritzl was that Austrian man who imprisoned and abused his daughter for years.
Oh, yeah, that horrific case. I remember that.
Yeah, it was absolutely shocking.
The whole world was horrified by it.
Absolutely. And Žižek uses this disturbing case to shed light on Freud's concept of the primordial father.
Okay, back up for a second. The primordial father.
Right.
What is that exactly?
So it's not about your actual father.
Okay.
It's more like a symbolic figure who represents ultimate authority and ownership.
Okay.
So imagine the most powerful king or dictator, someone who embodies absolute control.
So it's the ultimate patriarch.
Yeah, exactly. And Žižek argues that Fritzl, in his own twisted way, was trying to become this primordial father.
Wow, within his own little basement kingdom.
Yeah, exactly. He created this perverse reality where he had total control.
And he used language to maintain that control, right?
Exactly. He controlled the narrative, he controlled the communication, and he used that to dominate and silence his victims.
So this idea of the torture house, it's not just about the limitations of language.
Right.
It's about how language can be used as a weapon.
Absolutely, as a tool of oppression.
And to illustrate this whole point about authority and control in families, Žižek actually shares this darkly humorous anecdote about his own father.
Oh, yeah. I love this story.
Tell me.
So, Žižek was thinking about changing his name for some reason.
Oh, okay.
And his father just, completely freaked out.
Oh, no.
He was furious.
Really?
He was shouting, what are you saying? Don't you know that by giving you my name, I gave you everything?
Yeah, so much possessiveness packed into that one statement.
Right, you owe me everything.
Yeah, just for giving you my name.
Exactly, and it really highlights how deeply ingrained these ideas about control and ownership can be.
Even in families that seem totally normal from the outside.
Right, you never really know what's going on behind closed doors.
And so you have this parallel between Žižek's father, who's obviously not Joseph Fritzl.
Right.
But there's that same kind of desire for control and authority.
Exactly. And it's all tied up in the name, the legacy, the symbolic power that the father holds.
And then Žižek takes it even further.
Yeah.
He says that Fritzl's basement dungeon can be seen as a perverse version of this primordial father fantasy.
Yeah. Taken to its extreme.
He creates his own little world where he has total control.
Right. And he controls everything, the environment, the relationships, the very reality that his victims experience.
I'm getting chills just thinking about it.
Yeah, it's a chilling thought for sure.
And then he makes this connection to The Sound of Music.
I know, right?
This classic, heartwarming musical.
Yeah, what does that have to do with Joseph Fritzl?
Right, exactly.
Well, Žižek argues that Fritzl's vision of this perfectly controlled family,
okay,
it eerily mirrors the idealized image of the Von Trapp family.
So obviously a sanitized version.
Of course.
In the movie.
Yeah, but it's he took that idealized vision of family and twisted it into something truly monstrous.
So the desire for this perfect enclosed little world,
Yep.
It can manifest in these really creepy ways.
Right, and what's even more disturbing is that Žižek says that this Fritzl mentality,
Yep.
this desire for absolute control,
Mm-hmm.
it can show up in different ways across cultures.
Oh, so it's not just about individual fathers.
Right.
It's about systems of power and control that create these perfect facades while hiding the messy reality underneath.
Exactly. He even points to the architectural plans of the Romanian dictator Ceausescu,
Okay.
who wanted to build this pristine Bucharest
Okay.
on top of this hidden network of tunnels and infrastructure.
Wow. So it's creating this perfect surface, but underneath it's all darkness and control.
Exactly. And Žižek argues that every culture has its own version of this Fritzl phenomenon.
Oh, interesting.
He suggests that in 19th century America, these controlling figures might have been wealthy capitalists who held immense power over their daughters.
Okay, so we see this theme in novels like Tender as the Night.
Exactly.
So this Fritzl mentality, it can take different forms, from controlling fathers to oppressive dictators to even powerful businessmen.
Right. It's all about that desire for absolute authority and the ways they use that authority to manipulate and control others.
This is heavy stuff.
It is.
And it makes you wonder what happens when those traditional structures of authority start to crumble.
Right. What happens when the paternal law, as Lacan calls it, breaks down?
That's a huge question.
Yeah.
Especially in today's world where family structures and gender roles are in constant flux.
Absolutely.
So what does Žižek have to say about this decline of paternal authority?
Well, that's a big question.
It is.
And he's got some pretty strong opinions about it.
Okay, so we're going to get into that, I guess.
Yeah, definitely.
But maybe let's take a moment to process all this.
Yeah, good idea.
We've been talking about power and control and the limitations of language and how those things play out in families and societies.
It's a lot to unpack.
It is a lot to unpack.
But it's important stuff to think about.
Absolutely.
Because these ideas, they have real world implications for how we understand ourselves and our relationships and the world around us.
So we'll come back in a moment and continue our deep dive into Žižek's Lacanian perspective. So we were talking about what happens when those traditional structures of authority, like the father figure,
Right.
they start to break down?
Yeah, it's a big question.
And it feels really relevant, like, in today's world.
Absolutely.
So what does Žižek see kind of emerging in their place?
Well, he's pretty critical of some thinkers on the left.
Okay.
Who kind of mourn the loss of the traditional family.
Okay, so they see that as like the root of all our problems.
Yeah, they blame things like feminism and LGBTQ plus rights for societal decline.
So they're clinging to this vision of the past that ignores all the problems that existed within those structures. It's like you're looking back with rose-colored glasses.
Yeah, Žižek would say that this kind of nostalgia for the past is misguided.
Okay.
It's a refusal to really engage with the complexities of the present.
So if clinging to the past isn't the answer,
right,
what does he propose as an alternative?
Well, that's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
One possibility that comes up in this interview is the concept of the law of the mother.
The law of the mother. Okay, I've never heard that term before.
It's a pretty intriguing concept.
So what does it even mean?
Well, it comes from the observations of a feminist journalist.
Okay.
Who was studying changing family dynamics in places like Italy.
Okay.
And she noticed that in many families, mothers were taking on this new role.
Okay.
Not just as caregivers.
Okay.
But as the figures who held the family structure together.
Okay, so it's not about going back to that traditional idea of the stay-at-home mom.
Right.
It's recognizing the strength of mothers in these new social realities.
Exactly.
But is Žižek on board with this law of the mother idea?
You know, he's a little skeptical.
Okay.
He acknowledges that mothers play this vital role in families.
Yeah.
But he's not convinced that this shift represents a genuine alternative to the traditional symbolic order.
So it's not just about swapping out the father figure for the mother figure.
Right. It's more complicated than that.
Okay. So if clinging to the past isn't the answer, and the law of the mother isn't a viable solution,
right,
where does that leave us?
Well, that's the million-dollar question.
It is.
And that's where Žižek thinks psychoanalysis can really help us.
Okay, but I thought psychoanalysis was about analyzing individuals, not entire societies.
Well, Žižek would argue that psychoanalysis isn't just about therapy.
Oh.
It's a tool for analyzing what he calls the uneasiness in culture.
Okay, remind me about Freud's book, Civilization and Its Discontents.
Oh, yeah. Great example.
What was the main point there?
So in that book, Freud argued that a lot of the anxieties and neuroses that we see in individuals are actually symptoms of deeper social problems.
So it's like those individual struggles are actually reflections of like a larger societal malaise.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm starting to see where you're going with this.
And Žižek takes this idea even further.
Okay.
He says that psychoanalysis can help us see the need for radical social change.
Even though it doesn't necessarily offer specific solutions.
Right. It's not like a how-to manual.
So it's more about like raising awareness.
Yeah.
And helping us to think critically about the world around us.
Exactly. It helps us to see the cracks in the system, the things that aren't working.
Okay. But if we go back to that idea of language as a torture house,
right,
how can we even talk about these complex issues?
It's a great question.
It seems paradoxical that Žižek is constantly speaking and writing if he believes that language is inherently flawed.
Yeah, and it's a paradox that he acknowledges.
Okay.
In fact, the interviewer in this piece compares him to a patient on a therapist's couch.
Oh, wow.
Speaking without really knowing how his words will be received.
That's a pretty vulnerable position to be in.
It is. But Žižek seems to embrace that vulnerability.
Okay, so if even the intellectual is caught in this trap of language, what hope do the rest of us have?
Well, he believes that intellectuals today have to accept that uncertainty.
Okay.
It's like throwing messages in bottles into the ocean.
You never know who's going to find them.
Exactly. But that doesn't mean you stop sending them.
So it's about trusting that your ideas might resonate with someone somewhere.
Yeah, even if you never see the direct results.
And this leads to the idea of the intellectual as a kind of hysteric.
Right.
A provocateur who shakes things up.
Yeah, someone who forces people to confront uncomfortable truths.
I like that.
It's not about providing easy answers or comforting platitudes.
It's about challenging the status quo.
Exactly.
And for Lacan, hysteria is often the source of new truths.
Right.
It's through disruption and questioning and refusing to accept things as they are that we can discover new ways of understanding ourselves and the world. This is fascinating stuff.
It is. We've covered
a lot of ground here.
Yeah, from the torture house of language to the decline of paternal authority to the role of the intellectual as a truth-seeking hysteric.
It's a lot to process.
It is. But there's still more to explore.
Okay.
Remember that seminar where Lacan analyzes the figure of Antigone?
Yeah.
Well, there's some interesting connections there to these ideas of defiance
Okay.
and the search for new ethical frameworks.
Okay. I'm intrigued.
Let's dive into that next.
Okay, but before we do that,
Yeah.
let's just take a moment to reflect on what we've learned so far.
Good idea.
We've been talking about some pretty heavy stuff.
We have.
Power control, the limitations of language.
Yeah. It's a lot to unpack.
It is a lot to unpack.
But it's important to remember that these aren't just abstract philosophical ideas.
Right.
They have real-world implications for how we understand ourselves and our relationships and the societies we live in.
Okay, so let's take a moment to let all that sink in. And then we'll come back and continue our deep dive into the world of Žižek and Lacanian psychoanalysis. Okay, so we're back, and I'm still thinking about this idea of the intellectual as a provocateur. Like someone who forces us to confront these uncomfortable truths.
It's a powerful concept, isn't it?
It is, and you were saying it connects to Lacan's analysis of Antigone.
Yeah, in his seminar on ethics.
So for those of us who haven't read the seminar,
Right.
Can you remind us, like, who is Antigone?
Sure. So Antigone is this figure from Greek tragedy who chooses to defy the law,
Okay.
even though it means her own death.
Oh, wow.
And for Lacan, she represents this radical ethical stance,
Okay.
like a pure desire that goes beyond social norms.
So she's like the ultimate rebel,
Yeah, exactly. She follows her moral compass no matter what.
even if it puts her in direct conflict with authority.
Exactly. And there's a sense in Lacan's seminar that this kind of defiance is like the only authentic ethical position.
Oh, wow.
It's about breaking free from the system.
Okay, but what does Žižek say about that?
Well, he points out that there's a potential problem with this reading of Antigone.
What's that?
It can lead to a kind of political resignation,
Oh, okay.
like a sense that all we can do is make these grand gestures,
Okay.
knowing they're ultimately futile.
So it's like embracing a kind of glorious defeat.
Yeah, exactly. Like saying, okay, the system is messed up, but there's nothing we can do to change it, so let's just die beautifully in protest.
I mean, it's a powerful image, but it does sound a little bit bleak.
It does. But Žižek argues that Lacan himself eventually moved beyond this ethics of pure desire.
Okay, so if pure defiance isn't the answer, then what is?
Well, Žižek brings up another literary figure, Signe de Coufontaine,
Okay.
from the plays of Paul Claudel.
And who is she?
He says she represents an even more radical and tragic ethical position.
Okay. I'm intrigued, House.
It's subtle but important.
Okay.
So Antigone's defiance, even though it leads to her death,
Right.
it still has this element of performance to it.
Oh, okay.
There's a sense of glory of making a grand statement.
Right.
But Signe's sacrifice is purely ethical,
Okay.
without any self-aggrandizement.
So it's like the difference between making a political statement
Yeah.
and just quietly living your values,
Exactly.
even when no one's watching.
Right. And this takes us back to that idea of the law of the mother.
Oh, yeah.
Remember, Žižek was skeptical.
Yeah, he wasn't convinced it could really replace the paternal law.
Right. But what if the law of the mother isn't about a specific person
Okay.
or a role, but a different way of being in the world?
Okay, so what do you mean?
Think about those qualities that we associate with motherhood.
Okay, like care, empathy, nurturing,
Exactly.
responsiveness.
What if those qualities form the basis of a new kind of ethical framework?
So it's not about imposing a new set of rules.
Yeah.
It's about cultivating a different way of being.
Exactly. Being more attuned to the needs of others.
Okay.
More adaptable, more focused on connection and community.
Yeah, I love that.
It's like moving from this rigid top-down structure
Right.
to something more fluid and responsive.
Yeah. Okay, but how do we actually make that shift?
That's the challenge, isn't it?
It is.
And I think this brings us to a crucial point that wasn't explicitly stated in our source material.
Okay, lay it on me.
What if the very attempt to articulate a new law or a perfect system
Okay.
is part of the problem?
Whoa, okay, so you're saying maybe the problem isn't finding the right system,
Right.
but the very idea of relying on systems.
It's a radical thought.
It is, so what are we supposed to do then?
What if the goal isn't to create a utopia,
Okay.
but to learn how to navigate complexity without needing those pre-existing structures?
So instead of looking for answers outside ourselves, maybe the real work is to turn inward.
Exactly, to understand our own motivations and desires and anxieties.
And through that process of self-discovery,
Yeah.
maybe we can start to build more authentic and ethical relationships.
With ourselves, with each other, with the world around us.
That's a really powerful message to end on.
It is.
We've been given a lot to think about from this deep dive into Žižek's Lacanian perspective.
and remember, this is just a starting point.
Right.
The real work begins when we take these ideas and apply them to our own lives.
So to all of you listening out there,
keep thinking, keep questioning, keep diving deep.
Yeah, and never stop challenging your own assumptions.
That's where the real growth happens.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, keep those minds open and those conversations flowing.